So as an introduction to the spring series, I thought that I should take pause and remember how this all started. And like so many things, it began with the French Revolution. Subjects of a monarch ruling by divine right were redefined as citizens of a rational republic. The citizens' body was no longer governed by the church, and the state took over the great hospitals that housed the destitute, placing them under the control of doctors. The Hôtel Dieu alone in Paris had 20,000 inmates. Doctors now had power over thousands of living and dead bodies. They could be observed, treated, and when they died, dissected to discover the lesions that had killed them. Thus, the Paris Clinic was born, and the history of modern medicine as we recognise it began. Doctors now had what would be called abundant clinical material, rather than simply individual patients who could exercise consumer choice over their therapies. The power of that clinical material was its very abundance, the presentation of disease en masse, where symptoms could be compared between the living and the cadaver. Doctors began to see that there were illnesses that people suffered in common, that they each was not sick with their own dis-ease, which is the origin of that, or imbalance of the humours. And to make sense of it all, their key clinical tool was mathematics. The French called their method the numerical method. They also talked about the bookkeeping of life and death. Centralised states early in the 19th century also began registering birth, deaths and marriages separately from the church's registers and conducting the first national censuses. From Sweden to France to the United Kingdom to the Low Countries, governments began collecting systematic data about their people. Mathematics again was at the centre of the making of the modern world. It provided what has been called the modern fact, that had a different quality of truth. And these new numerical facts about people made people visible to the state in a collective way. We can thank the French state, for instance, for the wonderful taxation records going back over decades and decades that enabled Thomas Piketty to rewrite the economic history of capitalism. But there was another innovation in the Paris Clinic that we still practice, and this is critical. It's a gift relationship where, in exchange for free treatment from the leading medical minds of the day, the poor gave their bodies for research and teaching. In fact, our public hospitals still operate on that gift relationship, except today you're asked if you mind having a student in the room, although of course you're not asked if you mind having a student surgeon do your surgery. These courtesies are relatively recent. Even in the 1960s, the outpatients examination wards of the Royal Women's Hospital had all the delicacies of an abattoir. Likewise, the data generated about its citizens by the state are a gift relationship. The fundamental data about a person, which starts with the registration of their birth, their marriages and death, belong, of course, to the individual, but they are in the custody of the state, and the state has to ensure their security, where they are kept with all sorts of other measurements and records: education, tax, property, wealth, criminal justice, social security, ability, disability, military service. They, of course, are used by the state for the art of government. Today, many developing countries do not register births and deaths, and they cannot monitor their public health and well-being of their people. That omission is often at the core of their failure as states. This historical byway is necessary in our contemporary anxiety, because in our contemporary anxiety about individual rights and privacy, we forget that fundamental gift relationship that exists between citizens and the state, patients and the medical professions, human beings and scientific research. In return for being clinical or research material, our bodies and our data collectively enable the advancement of knowledge that can be to our individual and collective benefit. No data, no research. No research, no better policy, medical treatment, social justice and governments. No accountability of government to ensure they govern in the interests of all their people. Data revealing the growing inequality in our society, for instance, are the people's strongest weapon in their political fight for social justice. Our problem to government data is perhaps a peculiarly Australian one. The Dutch have long been required to complete an annual household census that details everything about the inhabitants in the household, and that's accepted as just being part of your citizenship. The Swedes, starting with their Lutheran pastor's annual examination of the catechism, have been collecting population data for almost 300 years, and that now provides an intergenerational database with very strong, complete data from 1830 that's now being linked to their outstanding contemporary linked medical, social and economic data. The Swedes don't see this as an infringement of their personal liberty, but in this example of the instrument of better service and government. It may be that a settler colony, peopled by thieves, bankrupts, wayward sons, fallen women and the greedy that were beset with secrets and lies, developed particular sensitivities. However, the Productivity Commission has laid the blame for Australia's backwardness in the use of public data for research on bureaucrats, each jealous of their jurisdictions, each clinging to their data, believing that looking after it means that no one ever uses it. Researchers, for instance, have waited for years for the release of data on medical and commercial use of X-ray machines on children, that's such as for routine medical checks, for shoe sizes, all those machines in easy walking shops, and in utero, of course, so they could undertake retrospective studies of possible carcinogenic effects. It proved almost impossible to measure the gap between Indigenous and mainstream perinatal health because, for instance, midwives' records took so long to be released by the health department to approved researchers. The bureaucracy prevented important research being done. The rise of the modern state and the extensions of its powers into markets, into our private lives, has above all been driven by the needs of public health. In order to protect everyone, some personal liberties and privacy have to be overruled. That was a decision made for us by the microbes. Those intrusions into our personal space are considerable, except we don't even think about them. They affect our behaviour, they affect our children, our food, our drink, our sanitary practices, our workplaces and our public spaces. And these were all novel expansions of state power over daily life from the mid-19th century in the UK and followed very quickly on here. And they are still not in operation in many parts of the developing world where states fail to protect their people. States with good data collection and storage provide deep protection for their citizens, just as public patients make medical education and research possible in the gift relationship, so the public's data gives the people voice amidst the clamour of vested interests, lobby groups, elites and corporations. It provides the evidence of their rights and needs. It provides the evidence of their poverty and sickness. It provides evidence for injustices and inequality. As individuals, we entrust our data to the state as a custodian, and in return, the state has a duty to ensure that the data is used for public good. If this seems fanciful, consider what already happens in Western Australia, New South Wales, and Northern Territory, and soon in South Australia. Western Australia has an integrated medical record system where each member of the community has a confidential, unique identifier, not just a Medicare number, that is stored separately in a secure database, and all active and past medical records can be linked within a secure repository that's not accessible via the internet, so that the identifier which links the records is separate. Within the system, other data sets such as birth, deaths and marriages, criminal justice, social welfare can be linked via the identifier, so that an individual becomes the sum of the records that are linked about them, and their records can go back for a number of generations. Identifying data is stored separately from all other data. Now, if researchers wish to use this data, they not only need approved funding, they need ethics clearance and, of course, an approved purpose. Then they apply to the repository where the repository staff will extract a de-identified data set for release. The repository keeps its links to the research by requiring that the officer who extracted the data becomes a co-author of any publication or presentation. Now that's keeping the officers involved and their names and their accountability open for scrutiny. Now there are other systems where we must use names and addresses and whereby you can check within a week whether a particular drug is having adverse effects. They can get extraordinarily fast results in WA if a drug is beginning to do something wrong. When we have linked medical records in Victoria, which will come, the system will throw up in real time in a GP's office that the patient before them has received or sought a prescription for a dangerous opioid the day before from other doctors. Reporting of influenza outbreaks will be instantaneous rather than waiting for the selected practices to submit their reports. When you are taken unconscious to emergency after being in a car accident far from home, your medical records will be accessible on the computer of the treating doctor with your existing conditions, your current medications, your allergies and so on. Lives will be saved. But in fact, data that can use names and other characteristics for linkage is far more powerful and complex, providing much richer findings in population health, wealth distribution, social mobility and so on. And as for privacy, in many matters of health, in particular infectious disease, you have no privacy. You are not free to keep your infectious status private from the authorities if you have tuberculosis or measles or syphilis. And levels of access for medical personnel can be structured so that your entire life history is not on the desktop of the triage nurse at the RMH as you are wheeled in. What our protections have to be is in fact against the commercial use of government data. Governments must not be permitted to sell or share your data with medical insurance companies because they are not acting in the public interest, whatever their protestations. Governments should never be able to sell, as they have done, final school results to private companies. That's a completely unethical thing to do. You may not like universities and research institutes having a monopoly on research, but unlike commerce, they are highly controlled environments with sanctions where research projects have to be approved as justified, they have to be technically sound, and they have to be competitively funded and governed by the relevant ethics committee, and those ethics committees are very tough. Things go wrong in universities, of course, and there are rogues in the research community. But universities have a severe powers of sanction over their staff. As more and more private operators establish research businesses in competition to the universities, for instance, KPMG sets itself up as a population health researcher. People buy analyses from private companies who are actually harvesting it from university work and using that instead of using university-generated research. But as that's happening much more, the independence and integrity of the global scholarly community becomes ever more precious. The Productivity Commission's recent report has been widely welcomed in the research community, although there are of course still many issues to resolve. What is incontestable is that Australia is seriously handicapped as a research nation by our lack of access to government data that should be in the service of public good. We're in fact a laughingstock for our anxiety about privacy over the census. Our federation means also that much of our data collection is at state level, and states and their repositories vary considerably in their concerns about access and privacy. Currently, the Commonwealth has got entirely different standards of access in its archives from many of the states. Likewise, if you have a criminal record, you lose your privacy. If you're in a psychiatric hospital in the 19th century, your record can be online and so on. 4 decades ago, the privacy industry, which was a really rather cowboy outfit, itself an unregulated private market operation, there was suddenly all these consultants popped up, managed to close up much government and historical medical data from research. I remember one such private consulting boasting that he'd destroyed a file from the sacking of Jack Lang 70 years before that was marked never to be opened. Our National Archives Act releases government documents after 30 years, and that is fundamental to protecting democracy. The Productivity Commission's recommendation on managing privacy, therefore, is in fact to place the onus of surveillance and sanction on researchers' employers, the universities and research institutes, who can dismiss staff who breach confidentially and who can be sanctioned by government. Reputation is the currency of university life. Destroy it and you're finished. But these concerns should not deter us from embracing the potential of big data that is for the common good rather than for commercial profit or political surveillance and manipulation. The data government collects on people has huge power to speak for us collectively, to give voice to the needs of all of us, and in the great mass of data, the individual finds safety and anonymity in numbers. The digital generation has generated a lot of very dirty water that threatens to get much worse very quickly. But let's make sure that we don't throw the baby out with it. Thanks.